Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. This week we're going to start off with a math lesson. Isn't that exciting? Well, the first term we're going to be looking at is whole number. Now, it's probably been a few years since you had a math class, but do you remember what a whole number is? We can simply call them counting numbers. That's 0, 1, 2, 3. That's the numbers we teach our kids. No fractions, no decimals. Now, what about an integer? A little trickier. An integer is any whole number and it's negative. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and minus 1, minus 2, minus 3. All right, so what does any of this have to do with our Sunday school lesson this week? Actually, it has a lot to do with it. An integer is whole or undivided. And the word integer is the Latin word from which we get the word integrity from. A person with integrity is not divided in their loyalties, is not spiritually schizophrenic. They are the same on Monday at work as they are Sunday in church. They are whole. They are the same person no matter the situation. Well, for the Christian, integrity means that Christ is at the center of our lives all the time. He's not just a Sunday morning interest, not just a private faith, and not a fallback when things aren't going well. Jesus is Lord in every area all the time. And that's the message that Peter gives us in our passage this week as we continue in that unit that's called Character Counts. This is lesson number 6 called Integrity. The focal passage is out of 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 17. And the point of this lesson is be the same Christ-centered person at all times. Well, the Christians Peter wrote to were scattered across Asia Minor, and they were facing hostility because of their faith. They weren't being hunted down by the government just yet, but they were being mistreated and insulted and pressured to compromise. In the middle of all that, Peter calls them and us as well to live with integrity. And our first section of scripture this week is going to be 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. Peter explains how we should live with integrity in our relationships. Well, Peter begins in verse 8 with a string of 5 qualities, and let's look at each one of those individually. There's like-minded. We've talked about that before. This doesn't mean that we agree on every issue, but it means that we share the same values, the same focus, which is Jesus and his mission. Then there's sympathetic. That's when we care about what others are going through, and it affects us emotionally. We rejoice with others in their good times, and then we weep with them in their sorrows. A sympathetic person says, I feel for you. Then there's love one another. And you might think that agape is the word that's used here for love, but it's not. Instead, it's a form of the word Philadelphia, or that brotherly or family love that believers are to show each other. Then you got compassionate. Now, this is similar to sympathetic, but action is attached here. Sympathy says, I feel for you. Compassion says, I feel for you and I want to do something to help. Then there's humble. We think of others more than ourselves, and we studied that characteristic a few weeks ago. Well, these 5 traits show that integrity is not just about personal morality. It's about how we treat other people. Then Peter raises the bar higher in verse 9. He says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with what? With blessing. You see, integrity means refusing to stoop to the world's level when mistreated. Instead, we mirror the grace of Christ who blessed those who cursed him. In other words, the turn the other cheek type of mentality. Then in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, Peter quotes Psalm 34, verses 10 through 12, which reminds us that God listens to those who guard their tongue, who turn from evil, and pursue peace. In other words, God blesses people of integrity. Now, you may be familiar with the name Corrie ten Boom. She was a Dutch Christian whose family hid Jews from the Nazis during World War II. And eventually she and her family were betrayed, arrested, and sent to concentration camps. Corrie's sister Betsy died in Ravensbrück, where Corrie survived. After the war, Corrie traveled extensively sharing the message of God's forgiveness. And in one of her most famous encounters, she was speaking at a church in Germany when a former Nazi guard from Ravensbrück approached her and extended his hand and asked for her forgiveness. Well, in that moment, Corey admitted that she struggled deeply. This man had been part of the system that killed her sister. Everything in her flesh wanted to retaliate or turn away, but she prayed silently for God's help, and in obedience to Christ, she reached out her hand, forgave him, and embraced him. Corey lived out what Peter described in 1 Peter 3:9 about not repaying evil for evil or insult with insult. Well, some questions that you and your class need to struggle with are, how do you handle criticism? How do you respond to a difficult co-worker or a family member? Integrity in relationships means that you just don't talk about loving people, you show it, even when it's hard. Well, let's continue on by looking at the next set of verses, still in 1 Peter chapter 3, looking at verses 13 through 15. And we see to live with integrity in our suffering. Well, verse 13 says, "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good?" Now, generally, people don't attack or punish those who are doing good. Living with integrity, kindness, righteousness often earns respect rather than hostility. However, Peter knows that Christians in the Roman Empire did sometimes face opposition, even persecution for their faith. So he's saying, as a rule, a life devoted for doing good makes you less likely to face harm. But if harm does come, God still has a purpose in it. That's why in verse 14 he adds, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed." Peter acknowledged the reality that sometimes the world punishes those who live for Christ. He reminded believers that suffering for righteousness is not a curse, but a blessing. And that might be a good place to ask the class, how can suffering for righteousness be a blessing? Well, here are a few answers, and you'll probably come up with some others. Well, it identifies you with Christ. Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12 shows us that. It demonstrates the genuineness of your faith. Also, God can use it as a witness to other people. Well, then Peter goes on, he quoted from Isaiah chapter 8, verse 12. It says, "Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened." Instead of fearing people, Christians are to trust God. So here's the real test of integrity. Am I the same Christ-centered person when life is unfair, when people misunderstand me, when suffering comes my way, or do I abandon my faith when it costs me something? Peter said, don't fear their threats. Don't be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, as verses 14 and 15 say. That's integrity. Integrity says Christ is still Lord, even if I suffer for following him. Then Peter adds one of the most famous lines in the New Testament. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Now, the times I've heard that verse quoted, it's usually to tell that we always need to be ready to share our faith. That's a true statement, but let's notice the context here. When we respond to suffering with grace, people will ask us why, and they'll notice our hope doesn't crumble when life is hard. That's when we get to share Christ. Imagine that you refuse to cut corners or fudge numbers on a report because of your Christian convictions. Some co-workers may mock you or call you self-righteous or holy Joe or whatever, but others will quietly respect your integrity. If someone asks, why do you always do things the hard way? That's your open door to gently say, because I follow Christ and I want to honor him in the way I work. This is living with integrity, being prepared to give a reason for your hope. Well, our last set of scripture is 1 Peter 3, verses 16 and 17. And here we see we are to live with integrity in conscience. In verse 16, Peter mentions a clear conscience. This means living with integrity before God and others. It's that inner assurance that you are living in line with your faith. When Christians live honorably, accusations against them don't stick. Even if people slander or mock them, their good conduct exposes their lies. And eventually critics may feel ashamed because of their consistent Christ-like life that shows that the accusations were false. And you know, Daniel is a perfect example. His enemies couldn't find any corruption in him, so they attacked him over his faith in God. He prayed openly, knowing it would land him in the lion's den. But Daniel had integrity. He was the same man in the palace and in the pit. His life was whole, consistent, and centered on God. Then in verse 17, Peter acknowledged that suffering may come, but he makes a distinction. Suffering for doing wrong, you're doing a crime, you're dishonest, you're cruel, okay, that's deserved. But suffering for doing right, okay, that's living faithfully for Christ, that's standing for the truth, that's showing love, that's undeserved, and therefore far better in God's eyes. Well, in closing, as we think about integrity, let's remember that it's not about perfection, it's about consistency. It's about being the same Christ-centered person at all times. In relationships, integrity means blessing instead of cursing. Integrity in suffering means that it's standing firm in hope. And in conscience, integrity means living blamelessly before God and others. Integrity also means that when we aren't the Christ-centered person that we strive to be, we apologize. And that takes humility. It's an earlier godly characteristic that we looked at. And I believe it'll go a long way to say to your family member, your coworker, I am sorry I said what I did, or I did that. As a follower of Jesus, I know better. That's not who I want to be, so please forgive me. Well, the world desperately needs authentic believers who live with integrity. People are watching. They may not read the Bible, but they will read us. So what are they going to read? What are they going to see? I hope you've enjoyed this unit on character counts. It sure has been challenging for me, and maybe it has been for you as well. Well, next we're going to start a new quarter, which means a new book and a couple of new units of study. The first 6-week unit is called The Greatest Truths of All Time. We're going to start the unit next week by looking at the greatest name. And then in subsequent weeks, we'll be looking at the greatest need, sin, gift, command, and return. And then the 6 weeks, starting on October 19th, is going to start a unit called How to Handle Life's Interruptions. That's going to be followed by a standalone lesson on From Problems to Praise. Well, that's what's coming up. I hope you guys have a great week. I'm getting this out a little earlier than usual. So thank you so much for watching. What do we always say? Don't forget to pray for and with your class. Thank you, guys.